Jack Anderson, a millionaire and devoted father whose life has been shadowed by tragedy and loss. After the untimely death of his wife, Jack has sheltered himself and his young son, Eli, within the walls of their mansion, determined to protect the only family he has left. But when Julia, a compassionate caregiver with a story of her own, enters their lives, everything begins to change. Through moments of laughter, heartache, and trust, Julia helps Jack see that perhaps true protection is about opening one's heart to life's possibilities. Will Jack let go of the past and risk his heart for a new love? And can young Eli finally experience the freedom and joy every child deserves? Join us on this journey as Jack, Julia, and Eli find their way from loss to love, from isolation to family. If you're ready to be inspired, give this video a thumbs up, subscribe for more heartfelt stories, and let us know in the comments, what do you think it takes to truly heal after loss? Thank you for watching, and let's begin. The Anderson mansion loomed atop Boston's Beacon Hill, surrounded by a vast garden bordered with manicured hedges and old oak trees. Once, this home had bustled with warmth and laughter. But since Claire Anderson's tragic accident 5 years ago, the house had grown silent, mirroring the grief its owner, Jack Anderson, still bore. Jack sat at his mahogany desk in the large, high-ceilinged study, barely glancing at the cityscape visible through the tall windows. Outside, a brisk October wind rustled the golden leaves, but inside, the mansion was untouched by the season's beauty, frozen in time. He stared down at a photo of his late wife, Claire, whose laughing green eyes and infectious smile captured the brightness she'd brought into his life. Losing her had shattered him, leaving an emptiness that had only deepened over the years. A quiet knock on the door pulled him from his reverie. Laura Mitchell, his loyal assistant of nearly a decade, entered with a small, hesitant smile. She carried a slim black binder and seemed uncharacteristically unsure of herself, a look that hadn't escaped Jack. "These are the applications, Mr. Anderson," Laura said, her tone gentle as she held out the binder. Jack accepted it, nodding his thanks. Jack flipped it open, scanning the profiles of a new batch of candidates to care for his son, Eli. Each photograph showed a smiling, polished face, accompanied by a carefully worded list of qualifications. But Jack's initial hope quickly dimmed. He'd been through this process more times than he cared to remember. He'd hired many nannies, all with impressive resumes, but none had managed to stay. "None of them stay," he muttered, almost to himself, though Laura heard him. "Eli's condition and the circumstances are a challenge," Laura said softly. "But we need to find someone. Eli deserve stability." Jack's jaw tightened. He knew the boy needed more than just physical care. He needed companionship and support. Yet every attempt to hire a suitable nanny had ended in resignation or dismissal, each failure driving him further into isolation. After a long pause, he closed the binder. "Schedule interviews with the top 3 candidates for tomorrow." Laura hesitated. "Dr. Matthews called earlier," she said, a hint of caution in her voice. "He suggested we consider keeping someone long-term. He's worried about the emotional impact the turnover has on Eli." Jack's expression hardened. "I pay Dr. Matthews to monitor my son's health, not to advise me on how to manage my household." Laura nodded, accustomed to his defensiveness. As she turned to leave, she stopped at the door, glancing back at him. "Eli asked if you'd join him for dinner tonight. He misses spending time with you." Jack's initial instinct was to refuse, to turn to the safety of his work, his sanctuary. But he felt the weight of Laura's gaze and, beyond that, the weight of his own absence in Eli's life. A memory flashed before him. Eli, age 5, asking why his mother wasn't coming home, his little face full of confusion and heartbreak. Jack swallowed, feeling an ache in his chest. "Tell him," he stopped, the words catching. "Tell him I'll be there. 7 o'clock. Laura's face softened, and she nodded. Once she left, Jack glanced at the photograph of Claire on his desk, the guilt gnawing at him. He reached out, touching her face in the picture. "I'll try, Claire. I'll try." As the clock struck 7, Jack descended the winding staircase to the formal dining room, feeling the unfamiliar weight of his decision. The room was bathed in warm, ambient light from the chandelier above, casting a cozy glow over the table where Eli sat, wrapped in a blue blanket, his blonde curls tousled. Eli greeted him, his green eyes lighting up. He looked so much like Claire that it often left Jack at a loss for words. Jack forced a smile, feeling the tension ease just slightly. "Hey, sport, I hear we're having your favorite tonight." Eli nodded enthusiastically. "Pizza." He leaned in conspiratorially. "I even picked the toppings." As they ate, Jack found himself relaxing as Eli chatted about his day, his laughter filling the room like music Jack hadn't heard in years. But halfway through, Eli's breathing grew labored, and his brow furrowed as he struggled to catch his breath. Jack's heart clenched as he watched his son's face tense in fear. Mrs. Peterson, the temporary nanny, appeared at Eli's side, quickly offering him an inhaler. She and Jack exchanged a tense look as Eli's breathing finally steadied. The moment passed, but the fear lingered in Jack's mind. After dinner, Jack lingered by Eli's bedroom door, watching his son fall asleep, his small chest rising and falling steadily. The memory of Claire and her boundless optimism drifted through his thoughts. What would she think of the life he'd built for Eli? Of the walls he'd raised to keep him safe? Turning away, Jack knew that hiring the right caregiver was no longer a choice. It was a necessity. He couldn't keep up this solitary battle, nor could he deny Eli the chance to live beyond the walls of their fortress-like home. The next day, Jack sat in the formal sitting room, waiting to interview the nanny candidates Laura had shortlisted. He felt guarded, skeptical, expecting another round of rehearsed answers and practiced smiles. The first two candidates were well-spoken and polished, their credentials pristine, but Jack sensed a lack of depth behind their smiles. Their responses felt too perfect, too prepared, as if they were more interested in the paycheck than Eli's well-being. Then Laura led in the last candidate, Julia Hies. She was younger than he'd expected, her dark brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her attire neat but unpretentious. There was an air of calm confidence about her as she took her seat. "Ms. Hies," Jack began, glancing down at her resume. "Your experience is extensive." "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady. "I've worked with children with chronic health issues for 6 years, including severe asthma and cystic fibrosis." He nodded, surprised by the honesty in her gaze. "What brings you here?" Julia looked him in the eye, her face softening. "I lost my younger brother to cystic fibrosis. Caring for him was my first experience in this field, and I've spent my career helping children like him." Jack's guard slipped momentarily. This wasn't a rehearsed response, it was real. Her sincerity unnerved him, but he found himself drawn to it. "This position isn't easy," he said cautiously. "The turnover has been high." "I'm aware," Julia replied, her tone unwavering. "But I believe Eli deserves stability and understanding. My goal is to make him feel like he's more than his condition." Jack looked at her thoughtfully, torn between hope and hesitation. "I should let you know," he added, his voice cooler. "This house is heavily monitored. I have cameras in every room. Privacy is a luxury I can't afford." To his surprise, Julia didn't flinch. "If I were in your shoes, I'd do the same." A long silence hung between them, and for the first time in years, Jack felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, trust. He nodded slowly. "If you're willing to start immediately, the position is yours." Julia settled into her new role with a calm but determined presence. Her first encounter with Eli was gentle. She found him in his room, surrounded by books about oceans and marine life. His curiosity was palpable, but there was a guardedness too, as if he'd learned not to get too attached. "Are you my new nanny?" Eli asked, his voice wary but hopeful. Julia knelt down, meeting his gaze. "Yes, I am, and I hear you're an expert on oceans." Eli's eyes lit up, a small smile creeping onto his face. "I know a lot about fish and whales. My mom used to tell me ocean stories." Julia nodded, her own voice softening. "Then we'll have to make sure you keep learning. Maybe someday, you'll see the ocean yourself." Jack, watching from the hallway, felt a pang of emotion. He hadn't seen Eli smile like that in a long time, and it stirred a feeling he thought he'd lost, a sense of hope. But he kept his distance, maintaining his watchful eye over their interactions, unable to fully let go of his need for control. Over the following weeks, Julia introduced subtle changes to Eli's routine. She suggested brief outings into the garden for fresh air on good weather days and transformed his breathing exercises into playful games that he actually looked forward to. Jack observed all of this through the cameras, noting how Eli's spirits seemed to lift under Julia's care. She approached everything with patience and warmth, her care for his son extending beyond medical routines into the realm of genuine connection. And as he watched her coax laughter and excitement from Eli, he began to see what stability and companionship could offer his son. But despite Julia's gentle influence, Jack kept a wary distance, checking each monitor and report with an unyielding vigilance. He found himself caught between an impulse to protect and a reluctant awareness that Julia's way of doing things was helping Eli in ways he hadn't foreseen. One evening, Jack found himself standing outside Eli's room, listening to Julia read him a bedtime story. Her voice was soft, weaving through tales of the ocean and marine life, each word laced with a warmth that made Eli laugh. Jack lingered by the door, absorbing the unfamiliar sound of laughter filling the house. He wanted to walk in, to join them, but he felt a wall between himself and this new closeness, one he'd built to protect himself from the pain of loss. Later that night, he sat alone in his office, replaying the day's footage on the monitor. Watching Julia and Eli's interactions brought a rare calm over him, a peace he hadn't known in years. He realized, with a start, that he was beginning to rely on Julia's presence, and that dependency frightened him. But there was no denying the effect she had on his son. One cold evening, as Jack was wrapping up a project, he heard a commotion from Eli's room. Rushing upstairs, he found Julia by Eli's side, administering his inhaler as Eli struggled to catch his breath. Julia's calm instructions guided Eli through each labored breath, and gradually his breathing steadied. Jack's heart pounded as he watched Julia cradle Eli, her soothing words working wonders. He felt helpless, yet grateful, realizing that Julia's calm was something he couldn't provide. After Eli fell asleep, Jack found himself outside his son's room, unable to walk away. Julia joined him, her face etched with concern. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice raw. Julia nodded, her expression kind but firm. "He'll be okay. But he needs stability, Jack. Not just physically, but emotionally." Her words hit him harder than he expected, breaking through the walls he'd so carefully constructed. He nodded, realizing that for Eli's sake, and his own, he would have to let go of the control he'd held onto for so long. As he returned to his office, Jack stared at the photo of Claire on his desk. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to consider that maybe, just maybe, letting someone else in could be the first step toward healing. In the weeks following Julia's arrival, subtle changes began to breathe new life into the Anderson mansion. She brought with her a quiet warmth, and for the first time in years, the place felt less like a fortress and more like a home. On a crisp November morning, Julia found herself in the kitchen with Laura, preparing breakfast for Eli. Julia whisked eggs as Laura watched, a fond smile on her face. "You've managed to do something remarkable," Laura said, leaning against the counter. Eli has been smiling more. "I haven't seen him like this since before the accident." Julia looked up, surprised and touched. "He's such a wonderful kid. I think he just needs to know he's allowed to be a child." Laura's expression grew thoughtful, and she lowered her voice. "You should know Mr. Anderson doesn't trust easily. This, hiring you, letting you into Eli's life, it's a bigger step for him than you realize." Julia nodded, understanding. "I can only imagine. I can't pretend to know what he's been through, but I'll do everything I can for Eli." As she turned her focus back to the eggs, Laura smiled approvingly. She saw in Julia a rare dedication, one that might be exactly what Eli and Jack needed to heal. That afternoon, Julia convinced Jack to allow Eli a brief trip to the garden. She sensed his hesitation, but the gentle sunshine and clear air made the risk feel manageable. Just a few minutes, Jack said, his tone laced with worry as he watched them from the window. And stay close to him. Julia led Eli outside, marveling at how the boy's face lit up as he took in the world beyond his room. She encouraged him to breathe deeply, showing him how to let the crisp air fill his lungs. Feel that? She asked, her voice gentle. That's freedom. You deserve to feel it. Eli grinned up at her, his eyes sparkling. It feels like the ocean, like all the books we read about it. She laughed. Then we'll call this your little ocean for now. But one day, you'll get to see the real thing. Jack watched them from the study, his heart in his throat. For the first time, he saw his son standing in the garden without fear, without the shadow of his illness holding him back. And while it filled him with joy, it also terrified him. He lived so long under the belief that sheltering Eli was the only way to keep him safe. But as he saw Julia crouching beside Eli, patiently guiding him, he couldn't ignore the change in his son's face. Maybe, he thought, just maybe, there was a different way to protect his son, a way that didn't involve locking him away from the world. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, Julia's influence on Eli became more pronounced. She brought structure to his day that felt more like play than treatment, turning physical therapy exercises into games. She even encouraged him to set small, achievable goals, rewarding his efforts with stories and games. Under her care, Eli's health seemed to stabilize, his spirits lifting with every passing day. Jack found himself watching Julia and Eli with a sense of wonder and growing respect. Though he maintained his surveillance through the monitors, he began spending more time in the room with them, sitting at the edge of their interactions, careful not to intrude but unable to look away. One evening, Jack overheard Julia explaining the concept of resilience to Eli. Resilience is like being a tree in a storm, she said, her voice soft yet strong. You might bend, but you don't break. You grow stronger every time you face a challenge. Eli listened, wrapped, his eyes wide with understanding. Jack felt a pang of admiration for Julia's way of speaking to his son. She made him feel brave without dismissing the fears that came with his condition. Later that night, Jack found himself lingering outside Eli's room, feeling an unfamiliar sense of peace. He hadn't allowed himself to feel this hopeful in years, and it terrified him. One night, while Julia was tucking Eli in a bed, he asked her a question that took her by surprise. Do you have any brothers or sisters, Julia? He asked, his small voice soft with curiosity. Julia hesitated, glancing briefly at the monitor in the corner, aware that Jack was likely watching. I had a brother, she said, her tone gentle. He was very brave like you. He was sick for a long time, but he never let it stop him from being happy. Eli's eyes were full of compassion. Did he go to heaven? Julia nodded, a slight hitch in her voice. Yes, but he left a lot of beautiful memories behind. Jack watched this exchange, a mixture of empathy and sadness in his eyes. Julia's story stirred something deep within him, a shared grief that felt almost like kinship. For the first time, he began to see Julia not just as a caregiver for Eli, but as someone who carried her own burdens, someone who might understand his pain in ways no one else could. One cold November morning, Jack found Julia and Eli in the library, sprawled on the floor with books and papers scattered around them. They were laughing, building a map of an imaginary underwater world. Jack was about to quietly slip away when Julia looked up and caught his eye, a warm smile on her face. Mr. Anderson, would you like to join us? She asked, gesturing to an empty spot beside them. Jack hesitated, feeling the impulse to keep his distance. But the hopefulness in Eli's gaze swayed him, and he slowly took a seat. Dad, Eli said excitedly, we're building an underwater world. Julia says I could be a marine explorer one day. Jack's heart tightened at the sight of his son's unbridled enthusiasm, a spark he hadn't seen in so long. He managed to smile, nodding. That sounds like a wonderful dream, Eli. As he sat with them, listening to their plans, Jack felt something inside him start to shift. For so long, he convinced himself that keeping distance was the best way to protect his heart. But with Julia and Eli beside him, he realized that closeness didn't have to mean pain. It could mean hope. Despite the warmth Julia brought into their lives, Jack's old fears were never far from the surface. One evening, as he was reviewing the security footage, he saw Julia in Eli's room, guiding him through a breathing exercise that had become part of their nightly routine. Her voice was calm, reassuring, and Eli responded to her with a trust and ease Jack hadn't seen before. A pang of jealousy struck him unexpectedly, jealousy that someone else could provide comfort to his son in ways he hadn't been able to. He knew he shouldn't feel this way, but he couldn't help it. After all these years, he'd allowed himself to care again, and the thought of losing Julia, or even the fragile stability she'd brought into Eli's life, was almost unbearable. The next morning, as Julia prepared breakfast in the kitchen, Jack approached her. His voice was carefully controlled, but the tension was clear. "I just want to make sure we're on the same page," he began. "Eli's care, his safety, is my priority." Julia looked up, meeting his gaze with calm understanding. "Of course, Mr. Anderson. That's my priority as well." He hesitated, searching her eyes. "Good?" Because if anything were to happen to him, his voice trailed off, and Julia saw the fear behind his words, the vulnerability he was trying so hard to hide. "Mr. Anderson," she said softly, "I'm here to help, not replace you. Eli needs his father as much as he needs me." Jack looked away, a mixture of relief and shame coloring his expression. He nodded curtly, knowing she was right, but still fighting his own insecurities. For now, he would trust her, but he knew his fears wouldn't vanish overnight. As Thanksgiving approached, Julia suggested a small family dinner, sensing that Eli might benefit from a celebration, however modest. Jack reluctantly agreed, more out of a desire to make his son happy than any personal inclination to celebrate. The evening was quiet but warm, and Julia made a special effort to include Eli in the preparations. They laughed over small things, spilled flour, taste-testing cranberry sauce, and even the silly pilgrim hats Julia made for them to wear. Jack observed it all, a smile tugging at his lips as he watched Eli's excitement and Julia's gentle encouragement. As they gathered around the table, Jack felt a rare contentment settle over him. The mansion, once silent and empty, was filled with warmth, laughter, and a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. He looked at Julia, catching her eye, and for a moment, they shared an understanding that went beyond words. That night, after Eli was tucked into bed, Jack lingered in the dining room, his heart filled with gratitude and a touch of wonder. Julia had given them both something he hadn't dared hope for, a chance to experience joy again. One quiet evening, Julia was organizing Eli's medical files in Jack's office when a folder fell open, revealing a report from the investigation into Claire's accident. As she glanced over the words, one phrase leaped out: suspicious circumstances regarding brake failure. Julia felt a pang of empathy for Jack. He'd been carrying the weight of this tragedy alone for so long. But before she could process it further, Jack entered the room, his face hardening when he saw her holding the folder. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice low but sharp. Julia stepped back, her face open and apologetic. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Anderson. I didn't mean to intrude. It was an accident." Jack's expression softened slightly, but a guarded look remained. "It's private. I understand," she replied, her voice calm. "But I hope you know you don't have to carry all of this alone. Eli, and even you, deserve peace." Jack didn't respond immediately, his gaze shifting to the photo of Claire on his desk. He felt the familiar weight of grief pressing on him, but Julia's words echoed in his mind. Her compassion stirred something he'd buried, and though he didn't reply, her presence offered him a silent comfort. As the days grew colder, Jack found himself reflecting on Julia's words. He felt his walls weakening, an unsteadiness he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. One evening, he invited Julia to join him for tea in the study, hoping to find solace in her calm presence. They talked quietly, the flickering fireplace casting warm light across the room. Jack found himself opening up, sharing stories about Claire, about Eli as a baby, and even his fears about being a single father. Julia listened, her gaze steady and understanding, offering gentle words of support but never interrupting his thoughts. In that moment, Jack realized he didn't have to face his fears alone. As they sat in silence, Jack felt a sense of peace settle over him. The walls he'd built to protect himself and Eli were beginning to come down, one gentle step at a time. And for the first time, he dared to believe that perhaps there was still a chance for happiness. A happiness he could share with someone who understood the depth of his love and his loss. Winter settled in, bringing with it an icy chill that transformed Beacon Hill into a world of frost and quiet. Jack, ever vigilant about Eli's health, became more cautious, limiting his son's exposure to the cold. But Julia gently pushed back, emphasizing the importance of letting Eli experience the world beyond his room and study. One afternoon, Jack received an invitation from Eli's school for a family discovery day. Parents were encouraged to attend a special weekend event where children would explore interactive exhibits and science demonstrations. When Jack read the invitation, his instinct was to refuse. The idea of exposing Eli to potential germs, not to mention the emotional vulnerability of stepping into a world of other families, left him wary. But when he showed Julia the invitation, her response was immediate. "I think it would be wonderful for Eli," Julia said, her eyes lighting up with excitement. "He's been so curious about everything. A day like this could be life-changing for him." Jack hesitated, feeling the familiar pang of fear. What if he gets sick? What if it's too much? Julia placed a hand on his arm. "I understand, Jack, but sometimes the best way to protect him is to show him how to live. We can take precautions, but at some point, we have to let him feel like a kid." That evening, after dinner, Jack broached the subject with Eli, who was immediately animated with excitement. Watching the joy spread across his son's face, Jack felt his heart soften. Against his instincts, he agreed, allowing himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, this experience would be safe. The following Saturday dawned bright and cold, the air crisp with the bite of winter. Julia arrived early, helping Eli bundle up in a warm coat, scarf, and gloves. Jack hovered nearby, triple-checking Eli's inhaler, hand sanitizer, and extra layers. Despite his anxiety, Julia's calm presence reassured him. When they arrived at the school, Jack felt the weight of the experience press down on him. He hadn't been back since Claire's passing, and the sight of other parents with their children brought a pang of sadness. But as he watched Eli's face light up at the sight of the science exhibits, Jack found his own spirits lifting, his focus shifting from his grief to his son's happiness. The event was everything Julia had hoped for Eli. They explored stations where he could build his own small wind-powered sailboats, create simple circuits, and observe miniature ecosystems. Jack observed Eli's awe, marveling at the way his son's eyes sparkled with every new discovery. At one exhibit, Eli reached for Julia's hand, tugging her excitedly toward a display about marine biology. Jack watched as they laughed together, Julia's warmth filling the space around them. For a brief moment, Jack allowed himself to imagine a future where moments like this were part of their everyday lives. As the day wound down, Jack thanked Julia quietly. "You were right. This was exactly what he needed." Julia's smile was soft but radiant. "It's what you needed too, Jack. I can see how much you love him, how much you want him to be happy." Her words lingered in his mind, sparking an unfamiliar sense of peace. For the first time, he felt he'd given his son a gift that went beyond mere protection, the gift of freedom, the gift of experience. In the days that followed, Jack found himself opening up more with Julia, sharing pieces of himself he'd long kept hidden. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, he told her about his early days with Claire, their spontaneous road trips, and the way she'd encouraged him to embrace life with open arms. "Claire was fearless," he said, his gaze distant but warm. "She believed life was meant to be lived, not controlled. I admired that about her, even if I didn't always understand it." Julia listened intently, a gentle smile on her face. "She sounds wonderful. I can see where Eli gets his adventurous spirit." Jack chuckled softly. "Yes, he has her spark, and that's what terrifies me. I'm scared of losing him, Julia. Sometimes I feel like I'm just waiting for the next crisis." Julia reached out, covering his hand with hers. I know, but Jack, love doesn't come without risk. If we let our fear take over, we risk missing the beauty of what's in front of us. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Jack felt a connection so profound that it took his breath away. Julia's compassion, her unwavering support, it was unlike anything he'd experienced since Claire. He felt himself falling, but the fear of losing her, of opening himself to yet another heartbreak, held him back. The emotional intensity between Jack and Julia continued to grow, and it wasn't lost on Eli. One evening, as Julia read him a bedtime story, he looked up at her with a thoughtful expression. "Do you like my dad?" Eli asked, his tone innocent but curious. Julia's face flushed, and she glanced toward the door, half expecting Jack to be listening. "Of course I do, Eli. Your dad is a wonderful person." Eli's green eyes sparkled with a mischievous glint. "You like him like Mom liked him, don't you?" Julia's cheeks reddened, and she stifled a laugh. "Let's focus on the story, okay?" But as she finished the story, her thoughts lingered on Eli's words. She'd grown close to Jack, closer than she'd intended. His kindness, his dedication, and the vulnerability he revealed in quiet moments drew her in. She wanted to be a part of his world, even though she knew the risk of loving him. As the winter wore on, Eli's health took a hit. A sudden, intense respiratory attack left him gasping for breath one night, and Julia sprang into action, administering his inhaler and helping him breathe through the panic. Jack rushed in, his face etched with fear, and he joined them at Eli's bedside, holding his son's hand and murmuring reassurances. But as Julia worked to stabilize Eli, Jack's anxiety spiraled. Once Eli was finally asleep, Jack turned to Julia, his expression a mix of anger and desperation. "This is what I was afraid of," he said, his voice breaking. "You convinced me to let him experience the world, but it's too dangerous. I can't keep taking these chances." Julia's face softened, but she stood her ground. "Jack, his life is worth more than just safety. He deserves to live, not just survive. We can't protect him from everything." Jack shook his head, his emotions raw and unguarded. "You don't understand. Losing him would destroy me. I can't go through that again." Julia reached out, her voice gentle but firm. "Jack, I know what loss feels like. I lost my brother to illness, remember? But I also know that if we let fear take over, we lose the people we love long before they're gone." Jack's expression softened as her words sank in. The tension between them faded, replaced by a profound understanding. Julia had been through her own grief, and yet she'd chosen to open her heart again. Her courage humbled him. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted quietly. She met his gaze, her voice tender. "You don't have to do it alone, Jack." Despite the breakthroughs they'd shared, Jack's fear of vulnerability resurfaced. He began to withdraw from Julia, returning to the familiar safety of his solitary routines. The warmth that had developed between them cooled, and Julia sensed the change. One evening, she found herself alone in the kitchen after putting Eli to bed. Jack entered, his face guarded, and an uncomfortable silence stretched between them. Julia took a deep breath, her heart aching. "Is everything all right, Jack?" Jack avoided her gaze. "Yes, I think it's best if we keep things professional. For Eli's sake." The words stung, but Julia nodded, trying to mask her disappointment. She understood his need to protect himself, but it didn't lessen the pain of being shut out. As he left the room, Julia felt a heaviness settle over her. She cared deeply for Jack and Eli, but she couldn't force him to open up. She had to accept that sometimes love meant letting go. One night, Julia sat alone in her room, grappling with the uncertainty of her place in the Anderson household. She wanted to be there for Eli and Jack, but the walls Jack kept between them felt insurmountable. She began to wonder if she should leave, if her presence was truly helping or only adding to Jack's burden. In her heart, she knew she cared for them both deeply. But Jack's continued withdrawal made her question whether she could stay in a home where she felt like an outsider. The next morning, Jack noticed the sadness in Julia's eyes as she prepared Eli's breakfast. Guilt gnawed at him. He hated the distance between them, but he couldn't bear the thought of opening himself up to potential heartache again. But when Eli looked up and asked, "Dad, is Julia staying with us forever?" Jack felt his resolve waver. He looked over at Julia, who was waiting for his answer, her face filled with hope and uncertainty. Jack realized that he was at a crossroads. He could continue to let his fear dictate his life, or he could risk his heart to build a life where Eli, and maybe even he, could thrive. That night, as Jack sat alone in his study, he looked at the family photo on his desk, feeling the weight of the years he'd spent locked in grief. Memories of Claire, their laughter, their shared dreams. He felt the pain of her loss, but also the love she'd given him. And in that moment, he understood that he couldn't keep hiding forever. Taking a deep breath, he made his way to Julia's room, his heart pounding. He found her packing a suitcase, her face sad but resigned. "Julia," he said, his voice trembling. She turned, surprised to see him. "Please don't leave. I don't want to push you away anymore. I'm scared, but I don't want to live like this, closed off, afraid." Julia's eyes softened, and she stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "Jack, I'm here because I care about you. About Eli. I just need to know you're willing to let me in." Jack met her gaze, his voice filled with emotion. "I am. I want you to be part of our lives. Not just for Eli, but for me too." They stood in silence, the tension between them dissolving as they shared a quiet embrace. In that moment, Jack knew that he was finally ready to open his heart again, to risk vulnerability for the chance at true happiness. With his decision to let Julia into his life, Jack felt both liberated and exposed. He wasn't used to relying on anyone emotionally, and sharing the weight of his fears and hopes was unfamiliar. But Julia's unwavering presence reassured him, and together they began to form the beginnings of a life with a sense of peace and happiness he hadn't felt in years. Julia, too, felt a profound change. She was no longer just Eli's caregiver, but a trusted part of the Anderson family, something she cherished and took seriously. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future, a true home, something she thought she'd lost with her own family's heartbreak. One cold December evening, as the first snow began to fall outside, Jack invited Julia to join him and Eli by the fire. He handed each of them a mug of hot cocoa, the warmth and sweetness a rare treat in the otherwise structured household. Eli sat beside them, leaning his head against Julia's shoulder, his contentment clear. "Dad," he asked, his voice thoughtful, "do you think we could go to the ocean one day?" Jack felt a tug at his heart. He remembered Julia's words about letting Eli experience the world beyond the walls of the mansion. He glanced at her, and she nodded encouragingly. "Yes, Eli," Jack replied, his voice soft but steady. "We'll go. When the weather's warmer, we'll go together." The smile on Eli's face was the only answer Jack needed, and for the first time, he felt he'd made a promise he was ready to keep. As Christmas approached, the mansion filled with a new sense of warmth. Julia helped Eli decorate, stringing lights and hanging ornaments, and even convinced Jack to help them choose a tree. For Eli, it was the first real Christmas he could remember, and his joy was contagious. On Christmas Eve, as snow gently fell outside, Julia handed Jack a carefully wrapped gift. "It's something small, but I thought it might help," she said, her cheeks flushed with warmth and excitement. Inside, Jack found a small leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with delicate waves. Julia's inscription on the first page read, "For the memories we create and the ones we hold close to our hearts." Jack ran his fingers over the words, feeling a swell of gratitude. "Thank you, Julia," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. She smiled. "I thought it might be nice to have a place to write down your thoughts or moments with Eli, to remember all of this." Touched by her thoughtfulness, Jack placed the journal on his desk, resolving to fill it with memories, both old and new. After Christmas, Eli began to take more initiative, setting small goals for himself with Julia's help. He wanted to learn more about the ocean, to become an expert in everything from coral reefs to whales. He often brought his sketches to Jack, detailing the sea creatures he wanted to see one day, his enthusiasm boundless. One evening, Jack found himself at the kitchen table, helping Eli assemble a scrapbook. Each page held pictures of the ocean, snippets from articles, and drawings Eli had made. "Do you think I could become a marine biologist, Dad?" Eli asked, his voice full of innocent hope. Jack felt a swell of pride. He'd once feared that Eli's condition would confine him, but now, with Julia's encouragement, his son's dreams were limitless. "Yes, Eli," Jack replied. "You can be anything you want." Julia watched them, her heart full as she saw the bond between father and son deepen. In her mind, Eli's new confidence was a testament to the strength they'd all found together. One chilly January afternoon, Jack led Julia and Eli to a room in the mansion that had remained closed for years. Inside were boxes of Claire's belongings, her books, and mementos from their life together. Dust motes floated in the quiet air, as if frozen in time. "I thought it was time we did something with this room," Jack said, his voice hushed. "Claire loved the ocean. I think she'd want us to make this a place where we can remember her and celebrate the family we're building." Julia's eyes softened, her respect and admiration clear. Eli looked around in awe, feeling the quiet presence of his mother in the room. They spent the day sorting through her belongings, finding photos, shells, and letters she'd written to Jack. Julia discovered a small, worn journal tucked inside one of the boxes. "Jack, I think this might have been her diary," she said, holding it gently. Jack accepted it with a bittersweet smile, brushing his fingers over the cover. She kept these to remember the little moments. Eli looked up at his father. "Can we put some of her things in my room too?" Jack nodded, feeling a renewed connection to Claire's memory, but also a sense of peace. Creating a space to honor her felt right, like closing a chapter and opening a new one for him, Julia, and Eli. Inspired by his family's journey, Jack made a decision that felt both right and deeply meaningful. He wanted to create a foundation in Claire's memory, a charitable organization to help children with respiratory conditions like Eli's. It would provide resources, medical support, and hope for families facing similar struggles. One evening, he shared his idea with Julia. "I want to do something meaningful with what Claire left behind," he said, his voice filled with resolve. "To help others and to make sure Eli, and others like him, don't face this alone." Julia's eyes shone with pride. "That's beautiful, Jack. Claire would be so proud of you." Together, they began to plan, poring over ideas and goals for the foundation. Jack asked Julia to work with him on it, knowing that her experience and compassion would be invaluable. Her acceptance only solidified the bond between them, bringing their shared purpose and dreams into clearer focus. In early February, a cold snap gripped Boston, and despite their precautions, Eli's asthma worsened. One night, he woke up gasping for breath, his face pale and panicked. Julia rushed to his side, administering his inhaler and helping him sit upright to breathe. Jack joined them, his heart pounding as he held Eli close, murmuring reassurances. But as Eli's breathing remained unsteady, Jack's fear intensified. He couldn't bear the thought of losing his son, of facing yet another tragedy. As Julia helped guide Eli's breaths, she noticed Jack's hands trembling, his face etched with helplessness. When Eli finally settled, she placed a comforting hand on Jack's shoulder. "Jack," she said gently, "you don't have to do this alone. I'm here, and we'll get through it together." In that moment, Jack felt the full weight of his vulnerability. Julia had become his anchor, her strength grounding him. For the first time, he allowed himself to accept her support fully, letting go of his fear and leaning into the trust they'd built. As Eli recovered, Jack realized how much he relied on Julia, not just for Eli's care, but for the emotional strength she brought into their lives. The foundation they were building together, the memories they were creating, all represented the life Jack had once thought he'd lost forever. One evening, he invited Julia to join him for a quiet dinner in the study. The soft glow of the fire illuminated her face, and Jack felt a sense of peace wash over him. They shared stories, laughed, and reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Julia," Jack began, his voice unsteady but full of conviction, "I know I'm not perfect. I've made so many mistakes trying to protect Eli, trying to hold on to the past. But you've shown me that it's possible to love again, to build something new without forgetting what I've lost." Julia's hand rested gently on his, her eyes warm and understanding. You've shown me what it means to create a family, Jack. I'm grateful to be part of this journey with you. Their conversation lingered, unhurried and full of promise. In that quiet space, Jack felt that he was finally free from the chains of his grief. He was ready to move forward, with Julia and Eli by his side. The following week, on a cold but clear winter evening, Jack planned a surprise for Julia. He'd chosen a quiet spot in the garden, illuminated by twinkling lights and surrounded by fresh snow. As she stepped outside, her breath visible in the crisp air, he took her hands. "Julia," he said, his voice soft but resolute, "you've given Eli and me a life I never thought possible. You've brought hope, laughter, and love back into this home. And I don't want to spend another day without you by my side." Julia's eyes widened, her cheeks pink from the cold and emotion. Jack took a small box from his pocket, revealing a delicate sapphire ring surrounded by tiny diamonds. "Will you marry me?" he asked, his voice full of hope. Julia's smile was radiant as she nodded, tears filling her eyes. "Yes, Jack, I'd be honored." He slipped the ring onto her finger, pulling her close as they shared a gentle, heartfelt kiss. In that moment, Jack felt the fullness of his love for her, a love rooted in trust, resilience, and the promise of a future they would build together. The news of their engagement brought joy to Eli, who declared that Julia was already part of the family in his heart. As they prepared for the future, Jack felt an overwhelming gratitude for the family he'd found, and he began documenting their journey in the journal Julia had gifted him. One evening, as Eli sat beside him on the couch, Jack showed him the journal. "This is our story," he said, his voice warm. "One day, I'll pass this on to you, so you can remember how much you're loved." Eli smiled, leaning against his father. "Can I add to it too?" Jack chuckled. "Eli, this story belongs to all of us." As winter melted into spring, life at the Anderson household settled into a warm, steady rhythm. Jack and Julia continued planning their future together, balancing their commitment to the Anderson Foundation with their devotion to Eli. But as if life itself were testing their resolve, an unexpected crisis loomed on the horizon. One night, Eli came down with a fever, something Jack and Julia initially thought was just a mild cold. They treated him at home, following his regular protocol, but as the days passed, his symptoms worsened. Jack and Julia grew increasingly worried, but neither wanted to admit just how frightened they were. When Eli's breathing grew dangerously labored one evening, Jack made the decision to take him to the hospital. The familiar pang of fear surged in his chest as he helped Julia carry Eli to the car, his mind racing with memories of past hospital visits, nights spent sleepless with worry, and the constant threat of losing the one person he had left of Claire. At the hospital, doctors worked swiftly to stabilize Eli, running tests and administering treatment. Julia and Jack sat side by side in the waiting room, their hands clasped tightly. Jack's mind drifted to the life they'd built, the promises he'd made, and the dreams he'd allowed himself to imagine. He was terrified that in one cruel twist of fate, he might lose it all. But Julia's hand in his reminded him of the strength they'd forged together. She looked at him, her gaze steady, filled with reassurance and faith. "He's strong, Jack. He's resilient. And we're here for him, every step of the way." Her words calmed him, reminding him that he wasn't alone in this battle. No matter what happened, they were a family, and they would face this together. After a long, tense night, Eli's condition stabilized. As dawn broke over Boston, the doctor entered the room to share the good news. Eli was responding well to treatment and could return home within a few days. Jack's relief was palpable, and he took Julia's hand, his gratitude overwhelming him. Once Eli was settled in his hospital bed, sleeping soundly, Jack and Julia went for a quiet walk down the hospital corridor. Jack felt a weight lift off his shoulders, and as they walked, he stopped, turning to her. "Julia, I don't know what I'd do without you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I know I've said it before, but thank you for being here, for everything." Julia smiled, her eyes full of warmth and understanding. You don't have to thank me, Jack. This is what family does. We're in this together, all of us. In that moment, Jack understood the depth of his love for her. It was a love built on resilience, trust, and a shared vision of the future. And he knew that no matter what life brought their way, they would face it together as a family. When Eli was discharged from the hospital, he came home to find a surprise. Julia had transformed the garden with his favorite flowers and decorations, creating a small outdoor haven for him to rest and recover. She'd even set up a telescope, so he could stargaze without leaving the warmth of his blanket. Eli was thrilled, his eyes lighting up with gratitude as he looked around. "Thank you, Julia. This is amazing." Jack stood beside them, watching as Julia helped Eli settle into a comfortable chair. He felt an overwhelming pride in the family they'd become. He knelt down beside Eli, his voice gentle. "We're so happy you're home, Eli. And remember, we're here for you, no matter what." Eli grinned, squeezing both Jack's and Julia's hands. "I know. I feel like the luckiest kid in the world." And in that moment, Jack knew that he, too, was the luckiest man in the world. The love they shared was the kind that could withstand any storm, a love that brought hope and healing. As spring blossomed around them, Jack and Julia decided to set a date for their wedding. They chose a sunny June day, planning an intimate ceremony in the mansion's garden, surrounded by close friends and family. Eli was overjoyed, eager to be part of the preparations and help bring their dreams to life. One evening, as they sat together over dinner, Eli made a special request. "Can I be the one to give Julia away?" he asked, his voice brimming with excitement. Jack and Julia exchanged a surprised, touched glance. Julia reached out, ruffling Eli's hair. "I would be honored, Eli." The weeks that followed were filled with joy and anticipation. Jack, once so accustomed to living in shadows, now found himself looking forward to every day with a newfound sense of hope. He couldn't wait to start this next chapter of his life with Julia and Eli by his side. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and warm, a perfect June day. Jack stood in the garden, watching as the last touches were added to the setup. White and blue flowers adorned the archway, their delicate fragrance filling the air. Friends and family gathered, their smiles and laughter creating a joyful atmosphere that permeated the space. When Julia appeared, escorted by Eli, Jack's breath caught. She wore a simple ivory gown that flowed gracefully, her hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders. But it was her smile that captured him, a smile filled with love, warmth, and the promise of a future they'd build together. As they met under the arch, Jack took Julia's hands, his heart full. The officiant spoke, but for Jack, time seemed to pause. He could only see her, feel the love and gratitude that had grown in his heart since the day she entered their lives. When it was time to exchange vows, Jack's voice was steady, filled with sincerity and emotion. "Julia, you've taught me to love again, to hope, and to live beyond fear. I promise to honor this life we're building, to protect it, and to cherish you and Eli, always." Julia's eyes glistened with tears as she spoke her vows. "Jack, you and Eli have given me a family, a place to call home. I promise to stand by you, to love and support you, and to cherish every moment we have together." As they exchanged rings and sealed their vows with a kiss, Eli clapped with glee, his laughter filling the air. The crowd cheered, and Jack felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over him. For the first time in years, he felt whole. Following the wedding, Jack and Julia focused on growing the Anderson Foundation, pouring their energy and passion into helping children and families affected by respiratory illnesses. Eli, with his love for the ocean, became their unofficial ambassador, often sharing his story at events and inspiring others with his dreams of one day becoming a marine biologist. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Eli brought out a new edition for their family scrapbook, a photo of the three of them at a recent foundation event, smiling and holding hands. "Can we put this in the memory room?" Eli asked, his eyes bright with hope. "So Mom can see how happy we are?" Jack's heart swelled with love. "Of course, Eli. I think she'd be very proud of the life we've built." They placed the photo in the memory room, adding it to the collection of mementos that represented not only their past, but also their future. The room, once filled with sadness, now radiated warmth, a tribute to Claire's memory and the family they'd created together. As promised, Jack and Julia took Eli on another trip to the ocean that summer. This time, they went further up the coast, visiting a quiet beach where the waves crashed softly against the shore, stretching endlessly into the horizon. They spent the day exploring, collecting shells, and watching the seabirds. Eli ran along the shore, laughing as the waves lapped at his feet. Jack and Julia walked hand in hand, watching him, their hearts filled with peace. That evening, they sat by a small fire on the beach, watching the stars twinkle above them. Eli nestled between Jack and Julia, his eyes bright as he pointed out constellations he'd read about. "Dad," he said, his voice soft, "do you think Mom can see us from up there?" Jack placed an arm around Eli, his voice full of quiet assurance. "I believe she can, and I think she's very happy for us." Eli smiled, his face peaceful as he leaned against his father. "I think she's happy we have Julia, too." Julia felt tears prick her eyes, and she placed a gentle hand on Eli's shoulder. "I feel very lucky to be here with both of you." Together, they sat in comfortable silence, the sound of the ocean filling the air. In that moment, they were a family, bound by love, resilience, and the memories they created together. As the years passed, the Anderson family continued to grow and thrive. Eli's health improved, and his confidence blossomed. He pursued his dream of studying marine biology, each day taking steps closer to his goal. Jack and Julia remained deeply committed to the foundation, using their resources to bring hope to others. They filled their days with laughter, adventures, and quiet moments, building a life that honored both their past and their future. Jack continued to write in the journal Julia had given him, filling its pages with memories, gratitude, and dreams for the years ahead. One summer evening, as they gathered on the porch to watch the sunset, Jack looked around at his family, his heart brimming with gratitude. He reached for Julia's hand, feeling the warmth and strength of her love beside him. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice filled with emotion. Julia smiled, leaning into his embrace. "For what?" "For showing me that life can be beautiful again," he replied, his voice soft. "For giving me a reason to hope." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, the Anderson family sat together, content and complete. They had faced loss, fear, and doubt, but they had come through it stronger, bound by a love that could withstand any storm. 15 years had passed since Julia first walked through the doors of the Anderson mansion, a time filled with challenges, laughter, and a love that had grown deeper with each passing year. The Anderson Foundation had flourished, reaching families across the country, and Eli, now in his early 20s, was about to embark on a journey he'd dreamed of since childhood. On a warm, breezy morning, Jack and Julia stood on the shore, watching Eli as he prepared for a research expedition in marine biology, a trip he'd been working toward for years. He stood by the water's edge, the waves lapping at his feet, his eyes alight with anticipation and pride. Eli turned to face his parents, a soft smile on his face. "You know, this is what I've dreamed of since I was a kid," he said. "And it's all because of you." Julia's eyes shone with emotion as she hugged him tightly. "We're so proud of you, Eli. You've worked so hard, and you're going to make a difference in the world." Jack placed a hand on Eli's shoulder, his gaze steady. "Your mother would be proud, too. She'd be overjoyed to see you living your dreams." Eli's eyes softened. "I know, Dad. I feel her with me, every day. And I know she'd be grateful for you and Julia, for the life you've given me." As Eli boarded the research vessel, waving back at his parents, Jack and Julia shared a quiet, knowing look. They'd spent years building a life that honored both the memory of those they'd lost and the future they'd created together. Jack felt a peace he hadn't known in years, a peace that came from embracing both his past and his present. They walked hand in hand along the shore, the ocean stretching endlessly before them. As they watched the sun dip toward the horizon, Jack took a deep breath, his voice filled with gratitude. Thank you for everything, Julia. For helping me find my way, for being here. Julia leaned into him, her smile gentle and warm. We found our way together, Jack, and I wouldn't have it any other way. They sat together on a weathered driftwood log, watching the waves roll in, each one bringing with it memories, dreams, and promises for the future. They knew that the life they'd built was one born of love and resilience, a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. Upon their return to Boston, Jack and Julia visited the memory room they'd created years ago, a room that had become a sanctuary for memories, dreams, and tokens of their shared journey. Eli had left behind a note for them, pinned to the wall alongside a drawing he'd made as a child of their family, standing under the stars. The note read, "Thank you for teaching me that family is about love, that life is about resilience, and that dreams are worth pursuing. I carry you with me, always." Jack's heart swelled with pride as he read Eli's words. He turned to Julia, a smile breaking across his face. "We did good, didn't we?" Julia nodded, her eyes full of warmth. "We did, Jack. We created a life worth living and a legacy worth leaving behind." Years later, as they grew older together, Jack and Julia continued their work with the Anderson Foundation, dedicating their lives to helping others. The foundation had grown beyond what they'd imagined, providing support to thousands of families and carrying on the memory of Claire and the strength she'd given them. Every year on the anniversary of Claire's passing, Jack, Julia, and Eli would gather by the ocean to honor her memory, sharing stories and memories that kept her spirit alive. These gatherings became a treasured tradition, a reminder of the love that had brought them together and the future they'd built in her honor. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey with the Anderson family, a story of love, resilience, and the power of hope. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more heartwarming tales, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you'll never miss a new story that will move, inspire, and bring a little lighter into your day. Please give this video a thumbs up if it touched your heart, and leave a comment below sharing what part of the Andersons' journey meant the most to you. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue sharing stories that celebrate the beauty of family, healing, and second chances. Thank you for watching, and we can't wait to see you next time.